How's that?
Better.
Okay, so what I'm going to share with you is some far out concepts, really, and also some unorthodox ways of using known pottery minerals that are still used today, but maybe in ancient times they were used, but in very different ways. So I hope to share with you thoughts on what local mineral geology and trade resources could have made mineral painted pots successful in this area, and could contributed to success in other areas as well, using mineral paint and white slipped pottery. I became puzzled and mesmerized by the beautiful black and white, red painted pots of the Mimbres, so much so that I spent a great deal of time using pottery chemistry, geology, and accepted archaeological information on trade networks and scientific analysis of sherds, along with my own countless hours studying sherds under low-power microscope to come to some understanding of what may be going on with Mimbres black, red, and white painted pots. Not to mention countless test fires, as I'm sure you all would understand, being ancient pottery replicators with the same passion I've acquired. I acquired this passion kind of by accident. My wife and I have been amateur potters for some time, and I got bored making coffee mugs and teapots and thought it might be kind of cool to get some mud from the desert and some rocks and make some Mimbres pots, you know? Boy, was I in for a ride. But thanks to Andy Ward and people like Tony Soares and Wes, who put videos on YouTube, I've learned a lot. Andy's videos have taught me a lot, gave me a good schooling on coil building, mineral and organic paints, how to look for wild clays, a whole wealth of knowledge shared. So a little bit about the way I go about this is my test fires begin in a propane-fired reduction kiln, where I can witness thermal reactions to clays and mineral paints, and I can also control the oxidation and reduction as well as the temperature. Always trying to mimic an ancient hearth fire, and any promising blend or clays will end up in my pit fire to see if it holds up to the real deal. So going back to my coffee mugs and teapots, I knew in a gas kiln in reduction that red iron clays and glazes can turn black, which often is what has puzzled us about the Mimbres pottery, is how they have sometimes this gradation of red to black, or black to red, however you want to look at it. So having done some reduction firing at high temperatures with glazes, I knew this could occur. But it's not always desirable when you're attempting a red glaze, but to me it made me wonder, could the Mimbres pots and other ancient folks used a glaze of sorts? I tried smothering for reduction with no luck, but I thought that the concept of smothering was most likely correct to some degree. But what if there were actually a micro glaze surrounding the paint at just the right time in the fire, and then hardening before the iron, as we all know, will turn back to red when it gets oxygen? Are most of you familiar with that concept, how red iron oxide works in a fire? Okay. So what happens when you paint your pots with red iron oxide, you can sometimes even see them in the fire, or after they're fired, they're just beautiful black. And then after they cool down, or as they're cooling down, somewhere around 300 degrees Fahrenheit. And I apologize too, I talk a lot in Fahrenheit, so if you need to get out your phone to do some conversions, that's fine, I don't mind. But what will happen is, as oxygen re-enters the iron oxide, it turns back to red. So it's been a real puzzle for me, and I'm sure many of you, as to how in the world they had this combination of red and black, or turning iron, what is known as iron, into black paint. So my thoughts were that there could be a micro glaze that is surrounding the red iron oxide at just the right temperature, and then hardening before the iron gets enough oxygen to turn red again. We've noticed this durable coloration of this durable paint on Mimbres pottery as well. It's very durable, so it made me wonder, could a glaze be involved? And did they actually master this? before they left the area around 1130, 1140 AD. So I want you all to know too, I still don't know for sure, and there's still more testing to do, but I'm convinced they did in fact. Oh, thank you. Just give me one more time. Oh, let me get it back. Sorry. Oh, there we go. Okay. So, anyway, I wanted you all to know that I'm really still not sure how this whole thing works, but I am convinced that they did in fact have some access to some great melty stuff that they may have used throughout the Mogollon region for a long period of time, even in cookware, plain and corrugated pots. I see evidence of solid melty stuff on many of the sherds I've looked at under a microscope that resemble known melty stuff still used today in pottery. But not in the same way. I don't think they use it in the same way. Of course they did. And also in some of my own test tiles using these melty stuffs, I've seen similarities that are very similar to ancient Mimbres sherds. I've seen evidence of sodium scumming, if you're familiar with that, on even cookware pottery and some of the painted pottery. Sodium scumming is where there's a large amount of sodium in the clay body or in the slib that will precipitate to the surface of the clay pot, and before it's fired, you may not even notice this until after it's fired, and then you'll see this discoloration in the pot. I've seen some of this on Mimbres pots as well as some of my own test sherds. So to really kind of explain a lot of this, I've got to get into a little bit of the chemistry. Chemistry today is the same as it was 1,000 years ago. Things that melt today melted 1,000 years ago. And pottery, if there is a glaze happening, there are three things that have to happen. There's three things that have to be involved. There has to be a glass former, which can be silica. That's what we use today in high fire pottery. Silica is melted, and then it surrounds the form, the pottery form, and creates a protective layer. But there's also things like fluxes that have to play a role. Fluxes help glasses and glass formers melt. And then you have stabilizers. Stabilizers are things that keep everything from literally just melting right off the pot or right into the clay body. So what are glass formers? Some of the glass formers, of course, are silica. I'll be honest with you, I think silica played very little role in Mimbres pottery or ancient pottery. It helped center the clay so it became a solid bowl. What we would call bisqueware in modern clay, or modern pottery, that would be ancient pottery. It's basically fired to a bisqueware temperature. So the silica had very little melt, I believe, that contributed to the success of black and white Mimbres pottery. There are other things that can be considered glass formers, like borates. Borate minerals can be ulexite, colmanite, hectorite. Ulexite and colmanite are still used today, and small amounts of hectorite are used today in pottery. But they do occur naturally in nature, and they're great melters. Borate minerals can actually form a glass by themselves. They don't even need silica. They can form somewhat durable glass by themselves. So the other thing you need is fluxes. Fluxes help melt the glass formers. These can be potassium, sodium borates, lithium, natural occurring things like nepheline cyanide, feldspars, galena leads can also be added to that mix. These are all for low fire pottery. If you're talking about higher temperature pottery, there are a whole lot more other fluxes, but in our interest, it would be low fire. And then you have stabilizers. Stabilizers are things that help control the melt, that keep the melt from happening too fast or literally melting, as I said before, and running right off the pot or into the clay body, which does happen. Stabilizers such as alumina, which is naturally occurring in clay, and there's also magnesium. Magnesium is also a good stabilizer, which can also form a matte surface, which could make you think that maybe it doesn't have a glaze, but it's because it's matte, it's not shiny, like as we know in a normal glaze. There's an interesting mineral here in Grant County that I would love to try. I haven't got my hands on it yet. It's called sibiolite, also called meerschaum. Meerschaum is a white fibrous clay, and it's actually a magnesium silicate, which would be perfect for a white Mimbres pot, I would think. Okay, so even silica itself can also be considered refractory or stabilizer, causing certain melty things to not melt too fast. So it's a real balance of stuff, and in fact, if in fact a glaze was happening at all. I do believe it was, but I don't think it was like what we picture as a glaze today. So modern pottery chemistry could only help so much, because most of it's about modern pottery. But there were some clues in studying modern pottery chemistry. There are some clues available. So one of the fluxes that I've had the most luck with is soluble salts. Soluble fluxes like sodium borates and other sodiums are usually undesirable in modern pottery, but I think played a big role in the Mimbres pots. Things like sodiums of various kinds are still used today in pottery, but they're calcined. Calcined means they're preheated along with other minerals to make them less water soluble, so they stay on the surface of the pot. But of course they did that. I don't think they did that. I don't think they calcined. Maybe they did. So other things that are used today quite extensively are borate minerals. I think I mentioned that before. So I'll be straight up. I really think sodium played a major role. Now, soluble sodiums and sodiums in general melt at different temperatures, like sodium chloride. I know we think of sodium chloride as our table salt, but it is available. It is out there in nature, precipitated. It melts at about 1470, and it turns into literally a water. I know oftentimes we think of soda glazing. If you do any research on the internet about soda glazing or using sodium as a glaze, most of the information on the internet is about actually adding salt crystals into your kiln when it's about 2,000 degrees. The sodium will vaporize, and it'll be attracted to the silica in the pottery, and there it will form a glaze on the surface of the pot. That's not exactly what I'm talking about. I'm talking about melted sodiums, not vaporized sodiums, okay? So if sodium chloride melts about 1470, that's within primitive pottery firing temperatures. I'm talking about Fahrenheit, by the way. And then there's also sodium borates, which are in this area. Sodium borates can melt as low as 1360. That's pretty low. And as I mentioned before, sodium borates form a glass all by themselves. They don't need silica. And then there's sodium sulfates, also nearby. Sodium sulfates melt at a little bit higher temperature, around 1660. But combined with other sodiums, they actually are refractory to the other sodiums. And then there's also soda ash. Soda ash is considered sodium carbonate. It melts at about 1560, which is right at that 850 threshold where most archaeology scientists believe that ancient pottery was fired at maximum temperature. So, if all of these interact with silica to form what is called a water glass, then it could be quite strong, especially if there's calcium involved or lime, which this area has a lot of caliche, a lot of lime. So it could have happened by serendipity, happenstance. It could have happened by accident. There could have been a combination of things that could have occurred, but again, I feel like sodium played a major role. I have turned red and yellow forms of iron black using sodiums. I have even gotten gradations of red and black, similar to this pot here on test tiles, using limonite, which starts out, limonite's a soft, yellowy, powdery, hydrated form of iron. It's kind of also considered like a rust, but it's a natural occurrence. It's very soft, very powdery, it grinds real easy. Would have been probably a good choice for a pigment if you were looking for something easy to make paint out of. I think in some pots, a combination of limonite and other hydrated soft irons may have been used, such as black goethite. Black goethite occurs in this area as well. I have some that was acquired between Deming and Las Cruces, if you're familiar with the area. It's, I'm gonna say as the crow flies, it's probably about 60 miles from here. 50 miles from here. My experience with limonite have been, if I fired it on a white slip, I would often get a really pretty red paint. And then when I started adding sodiums to my limonite, really interesting things started happening. I started getting red and black paint. So I don't know if the effect is the sodium is helping to cause impurities within the. Just wait for the mouse. Sorry about that. That's all right. I don't know if impurities within the limonite were causing a slag or a pig iron effect on the surface, or if it was actually, just literally causing the reduction of the limonite or encapsulating the limonite, like I'd mentioned before. So I also think the white slip could be mostly salts. I know that sounds crazy, but I'll show you here in a minute that it is possible that the white slip on Mimbres pots and other ancient people's pots could have been a high percentage of just sodiums. I think that mostly salts, or at least part of the mix, were involved. I've done test tiles with just salt and buff colored clay that fires kind of buff, and it fires to white. But like I said, I have yet to master this concept, but for me, when it comes to the notion that a low fire glaze could have been effective or used in ancient Mimbres pottery, I think that sodiums are the cat's meow. And the melty stuff has to happen. Then sodium or borates are the most likely fluxes. And I've had some success with them both. So where would they get sodium borates? Now, this was once an ocean. Well, we all know that, I don't know, several million years ago, this was all part of the ocean. So we have a lot of dry lake beds. We have a lot of areas where sodium probably accumulates over time. And as it rains, the sodium becomes part of the soil. And as it dries out, the sodium precipitates to the surface. I've seen areas where, near Faywood Hot Springs, where sodium crystals are nearly this high. Well, we'll get into that in a minute. So this was a lake bed, or there's many lake beds. There's also the hot springs, Tufa, like at Faywood Hot Springs, where many signs of Mimbres people were there. There's also sodium feldspars. Sodium feldspars are helpful, but they're not so helpful at the low fires that we're looking at, because they don't give up their sodium or their silica very readily at these low temperatures. There's also nepheline syenite. If you're potters, if you're making your own glazes, if any of you out there are wheel throwers or something like that, nepheline syenite's a very valuable type of feldspar. It melts at quite low temperature. It gives up its sodium quite readily, which can contribute as a sodium flux. And it doesn't give up its silica quite as readily, so it's not as much of a refractory or a stabilizer. So, where would they get these stuff? My favorite place, after doing a lot of research, happens to be the Tularosa Basin. The Tularosa Basin was the home of the Jornada people. They were also Magyar. Recent excavations have proved that the Mimbres did have relations with the Jornada people on the other side of the San Andreas Mountains at Jornada ruins. There's also Wind Mountain. Wind Mountain is just south of some of the major ruins in the Tularosa Basin. Wind Mountain is made up of, get this, nepheline syenite. The whole mountain is nepheline syenite. So that was interesting to me as well. Plus, like I said, there's Mimbres sherds all over the place there. I'll show you some images here in a minute. They may have used also soda ash. Soda ash, which is sodium carbonate. Sodium carbonate occurs at hot springs. It can be very white. If you're wanting to paint your pots white, it would have been very desirable to experiment with, I'm sure. Sodium carbonates come out of a lot of hot springs, actually along with borates as well. I also believe that much research has showed that ancient people did use things like soda ash acquired from plant material, plants that grow in salty environments. They used it to soften corn, called nixtamification. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that. Ancient people used lime and other alkali minerals to soften the corn before they would grind it. There's evidence that soda ash was understood in this area. So if you wanted to use known pottery chemistry and combine that with known trade partners, then my guess is the Tularosa Basin could have been a source of some of the best low-fire melters all in one location. It is known to have sodium chloride, sodium sulfate, and most exciting to me, sodium borates, also known as borax. And just down the way at Wind Mountain is endless supply of the low-fire feldspar known as Nepheline cyanide. So as a matter of fact, like I said, that whole mountain is pretty much Nepheline cyanide. So at a known Jornada ruin, two of them actually there have been claims for, guess what, precipitated borax. Near Lake Lucero. Lake Lucero is a ruin, a Jornada ruin, and also just above Lake Lucero, there's another ruin called Huntington. And guess what? Right there at Huntington, there was another claim for borax. Now I'm going to assume these were precipitated forms of borax. It's a soluble borate mineral that rises to the surface. So both of these ruins have provided hundreds of member sherds from the boldface period all the way up to the late classic polychrome. Recent excavations have raised the question, did the Mimbres people leave the valley here and end up there? Or did they have a long-standing trade partner for pottery stuff, also found at the ruins, were pottery production rooms that had grinding stones, unfired clay, chunks of limonite and hematite, along with what is identified as selenite in this excavation paper that I read online. And selenite is a crystal formation that is basically calcium sulfate. Now, selenite, it rises up, it's a crystal form, the wind blows, these particles of it ended up white sands. You know, I don't know if most of you are familiar with white sands. You know, it's a huge, huge mountains of gypsum is basically what it is. So selenite or gypsum, I haven't found very useful in pottery, although there are some papers written that they believe that some of the ancient Greek pottery, the white is actually a gypsum, but gypsum can also be created through the firing process. That's a whole other topic. But I think that it is possible that this selenite could have been confused with ulexite. Because, like I said, selenite is a crystal formation that basically is gypsum, and it looks an awful lot like a glass, or like it could be a quartz. Now, ulexite, the borate mineral that melts really well, can also look exactly like it. They can look very identical. So it could be hard to discriminate between the two. So the mechanics of how they did it, I'm still trying to understand, but recent test fires and a string of puzzling results, I'm thinking more and more the white stuff is the key. That the white stuff on Mimbres pottery is the flux. It is what has encapsulated the iron in different parts of the pot and caused it to stay in reduction. I think many of the pots too may have even been painted with black forms of iron, and some both black and red, or black and yellow, or yellow and red. I think throughout the region, Mimbres is a pretty large area. There could have been many different ways that they made them, but if they were understanding sodiums as a useful tool to help seal their pottery, make them less porous, it could have evolved into more of a practical use in their painted pots. Like I said, I do believe the slip is probably the most important part of the success of Mimbres pottery. Now, I know, you know, even we all think that the white is a clay, and it very well could be. Like I said, I'm not saying I know for sure what's going on. But up north, there are some really wonderful clays, the kaolins that are up there. They lend themselves very well to organic paint. But down here, I wonder if, as one archaeologist put it, that the Mimbres people may have been trying to imitate what was going on at Chaco Canyon, that they were trying to kind of imitate the white, black and white painted pottery. They may have done that, they may have wanted to do that in their own way, and they may have somehow created their own white stuff rather than having access to a white clay. Or the trade route, they may have gotten little chunks of white clay, but they wanted to stretch it. You know, when you only got a little bit, you want to make it go a long way. They may have began adding other white things to their clay to give them the different kind of success that the people at Chaco Canyon had with mineral paint. So I'm going to show you some slides, and we'll kind of discuss some of the things that are going on. We call it a slideshow. I'm showing my age now, aren't I? You know, we can kind of discuss, I'd like to discuss some of the things that are going on with the pots that help kind of lead me to these ideas that this possibly is a type of glaze. So, okay, next one. Oh yeah, thank you. Great, awesome. Actually, if you'll go back one from the first one. Okay, I wanted to thank my friend. The lady on the left here is a good friend of mine. Her name's Carol Kipp. Her and her husband owned a ruin near Deming, New Mexico, and they had Dr. Jerry Brody helping them excavate it back in the late 90s. She gave me a good handful of sherds to study and kind of helped me a lot along the way, so I wanted to give a shout out to her. So, okay, go on. Okay, so looking at this pot, what's going on here? We've got darker color at the top. We've got spots of this bright red. We even have this one little spot where it's black. To me, there's a real possibility that maybe they just had, you know, a lot of different irons that they were grinding up and using, or it could also be due to sodium precipitation, either from the clay body or from the white slip. Okay, if you want to go on. Now, this was a pot that I did very early on. This was using natural clay from near my home, and but the inside was glazed with a white raku glaze, which is a low fire glaze, and I painted on top of it with nothing but iron oxide. And then I fired it in a reduction environment, much like a primitive fire, but of course I did go to 1700 Fahrenheit. I just wanted to see if a glaze could actually happen over top of just nothing but ground up paint, could actually happen on top of a glaze. And I did, it did happen. My iron was trapped inside of the glaze when it was at the heated stage of about 11 or 1200. Iron oxide starts to turn black, and the glasses from the glaze encapsulated it, and as it cooled down, it stayed black. So, okay, if you want to go on. So, is that what's happening here? I don't know, but there's some similarities. This is a beautiful pot, probably made late in the Classic period. There is some evidence of red on there as well. This could have been done, in my opinion, with Limonite, with some good melty white background. It could also have been done with goethite, black goethite. Okay. The top one there is actually goethite. Now this goethite came from there again, kind of between here and Alamogordo, where the Tularosa Basin is. Just about halfway, there's some formations of this black goethite. Black goethite is actually, if I didn't mention it before, it's a hydrated form of iron. Now, it's kind of hard on the top part of it, but underneath it, it's very soft and very powdery and very small particles. And it makes a really nice paint, I'll tell you that. And the bottom one there, that is actually goethite from Chihuahua, Mexico. Also kind of part of what you might consider the Mimbres or the Mogollon region during the time. Okay. This is Limonite. I can't say I found my own Limonite. I bought that on Etsy, but I didn't know where else to get it. But there is a ton of Limonite, I'm told, that scatter all over the Oregon mountains and Las Cruces, and also in the San Andreas mountains, and really throughout the desert here. Limonite's not that uncommon. So you got to ask yourself too, what's happening here? We've got a red and black all together. So if limonite was used on the black, that could have happened. I know that for sure now. And the red could have actually been from hematite. I have found hematite a whole lot harder to reduce and stay reduced to a black state than I do limonite. This one's interesting to me because it almost looks like the white stuff almost became part of the melt. It may have gotten so hot on the right side that a lot of the white part of the pot became part of the pot instead of it stood on the surface and gave a white coloration. And this picture is a lousy picture, but the areas where it got the hottest almost seems as if the black is more prevalent in the iron. Okay. So here's another interesting thing. Now, I know this could be from the photograph, but you see a lot of these pots in ancient Southwest that have this kind of a greenish hue around the edges or around the edges of the paint. Well, believe it or not, borate minerals will do that. Borate minerals, I know lead will do it too, but I know around 12, 13, 14, lead was happening in a big way. But back in these days when the Mimbres people were doing it, supposedly lead wasn't really being used. But borate minerals will do that. Okay. So here's another interesting thing about the Mimbres pots. They have, oftentimes you see this one area that's stayed red while the rest of it's black, which has always been kind of puzzling. And I'll be honest with you, it's still puzzling. But if you'll go ahead and change the slide. One thing that seems to occur on a lot of these pots is you see this black spot right next to it, right above it, on one side or the other. So my thoughts were starting to wonder, this melty stuff that I was talking about, could some of the melty stuff have gotten so hot that it was no longer encapsulating the iron well and ran right through the clay body and settled in the lower area where it was sitting in the fire? Okay. Here's another one that probably comes from the boldface period. Very simple design, more or less. Same thing, so this was happening to them very early on. You see that red area right there? Okay, if you'll change that one more time. Same thing. You've got this one area that we of course call it, fireclads. But there's really not much of that going on anywhere else except right there where the red spot is. So my thoughts were, in looking at my pot's fire and my own fires, that part of the pot that's sitting on the rock, if your bowl's sitting this way on a rock, that part of the pot right here would collect melty sodiums that would settle down in the bottom and could actually do carbon trapping. And that's what I think that is. I think it's more carbon trapping from melty stuff. We'll call it melty stuff. Okay. Now this one really is puzzling. You got stuff going on all over the bowl. You got some red, some black, and it's very unpredictable. But what if the white stuff is the cat's meow? What if the white stuff is the contribution? And you're making this bowl and you poured your white stuff into the bowl, which most of you, do you know that the Mimbres people, it appears they poured a liquid white stuff into their pots and they would slosh it around and then pour it out, and they didn't really seem to care if it got on the side of the pot. The signs of fingerprints all over the sides. Are you familiar with that? Yeah. Well, that's what they did. Most of them looked like they just poured liquid stuff into the bowl, sloshed it around, and poured it out. So if that's what happened here, could it have been that the density or the thickness of the white stuff varied throughout the bowl as they poured it in quickly, sloshed it around, poured it out? Some parts of the bowl may have gotten a little denser than the others, depending on how dry the pot was when they slipped it. So, okay. Now here's another one that's very fascinating to me. It's a worn out pot in the Dimming Mimbres Museum that shows body reduction. You can see on the left there, the clay body. Since it's worn out, we can see what happened to the clay body itself. On the left there, the clay body is actually reduced, where on the right, the part of the clay body that's still red, the clay body itself is not really that much body reduction at all. Which makes me wonder, was sodium or a melty stuff put more on one side of the bowl on purpose to saturate that part of the pot more than the other side of the pot? I have actually, in my test fires, I've had sodiums cause body reduction at very low temperature, 1400 degrees Fahrenheit. So I find that one interesting. Okay. Is there any questions? I'm just going on and on. Does anybody have any questions, or you want to wait until the end? Yes, go ahead, Andy.
So like the whole slip slop thing, that's what Lexington called it, you know, pouring the slip in. Have you ever tried it?
That's all I do.
Like there's a picture I have that I got off the internet of Paul Thornburg, and he's got like a glass container. He's pouring slip into this bowl. So like if I pour slip into a bone dry bowl, it'll break in about 10 seconds.
Yes, you brought up a good point, and I broke a lot of bowls. But what I found is if there's sodium in my clay, body, it actually strengthens the dry clay body. But I've also found that that's still risky. What I do is I'll pour my mixture, my really liquid mixture, into my bowl when it's before leather hard, when it's still soft. And I also think that could contribute to some of the warped pottery that we see in Mimbres. Are you familiar with some of the really warped pottery? That could either be from fired really hot and the clay basically just started to sink, but could also have happened while they were slipping the bowl. Because it will sometimes, you know, when you pour it that way, when the bowl is still real wet, it will still work. So if you do that, try it with your clay like right before leather hard. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I'm sorry, I don't understand it. What caused the breakage? Was it hot and cold, or?
What was the question?
What caused the breakage?
Oh, well, if you slip bone dry pottery, you're adding moisture to that, and then the clay starts to expand unevenly, and it'll just tear itself to pieces.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Okay. Thank you. So here's an interesting possible example of a thinner slip. If you look up here where my arrow is, I can see where it looks like the slip in that area is quite thin. And that could have contributed to the fact that the paint stayed or fired red, where other parts of the pot may have gotten enough glaze around the iron to stay black. Okay. Here's an interesting one too. This other piece here shows a lot of crackle effect. The background isn't that light, it isn't white like most Mimbres pots, but I have done test fires with just sodiums, sloshing a really saturated brine of sodiums, mixes of sodiums into a bowl, and then painted and fired them, and they look just like that. They get this kind of a crackled look sometimes. Okay.
Jeff, if I can.
Sure.
So I use this Limonite, for my white slip. And I know that as it dries, if I let it go too far, like it gets the same crackle because it needs to be moister to get the polish. So I don't know if that has any effect, but I know that to be true. In fact, I have a piece that I'm going to refire, and I'll show it to you tomorrow.
Okay.
That has this crackle effect on it, and it was the case that I let it go too far.
Yes, and that's true. And that crackle effect can happen a lot with clays that don't have the same shrink rate. If you're using, say, a white clay like bentonite or Montmorillonite, most of the smectite clays like that oftentimes have a higher shrink rate than the clay body you're painting on. And so what happens is even during the drying sometimes, or definitely during the firing, the white Montmorillonite or bentonite or smectite clays will shrink more than the pot that it's painted on, and it'll give kind of the same crackle effect. The sodiums will do that as well. Okay.
Bob, could you correct that what you mean by letting it go too far?
So when I put the slip on, I usually put 3 or 4 thinner coats, and then I let it dry slowly, and I catch it right before it turns kind of a crisp dryness on the outside. So when I go to polish it, it kind of forces all of those platelets right into a really smooth painting surface. But if I wait too long, well, I don't get that consistent, smooth inner face on the bowls.
So you're talking about the time period between putting a slip on and burnishing?
Yes. Yep. Because if I wait too long and it gets dried out, I get this crackle effect.
Okay. I'm running out of time, got a lot to cover. This was an example too of a very high sodium and methylene cyanide slip on a test tile. The crackle effect happened there, maybe from the sodium. The B is actually a mix of limonite and clay. And E is nothing but limonite, just wet limonite. A is iron oxide, store-bought iron oxide, which is often synthetic, so you gotta be careful with that. They take a lot of the impurities out of iron oxide when you buy it from a pottery supply store. And I believe a lot of those impurities are necessary to replicate ancient pottery. M was a combination of, let's see, E and A. So if you're wondering what those were. Okay. Now here's another interesting thing too. There's a lot of round little pits that occur. Now these could be little pieces of grog that kind of popped out of the clay. But those are also very suspicious to me because a lot of sodium borates sometimes will have less soluble particles that will melt and look like that. I'll show you here in a second. Like right here, this is one of my test pieces, and those are little pieces of melted sodium borate. That, I mean, is it just coincidence? I don't know. Okay. So talking about sodium precipitation, this effect can kind of show up and maybe look like it's fire clouds or just look like an old pot. But I think a lot of the grayness to this pot is due to sodium precipitation. Sodium precipitating out of the pot. Now sodium will find the driest place. If you're familiar how that works. If you can imagine you've got a pot sitting there to dry, a bowl. And we probably all noticed that the top rim is the part we got to be careful with because that's going to dry first. That's also going to be where the sodiums are going to accumulate. Because if there's sodium in your clay body, all those sodiums are going to follow the water. And as the water is going up to the top of the rim to evaporate, that's where the accumulation is going to occur. Okay. I see the sodium scumming on this bowl as well, some of the gray areas. Okay, go on. This one definitely lots of sodium precipitation. If you look at these ribs, as I'll call them radiator ribs on the pot from the coils, you can imagine those coils, the outer edges of those coils probably got the most air. They probably dried first, and more sodium precipitated to those edges, which to me, this is really good evidence. This is a Mimbres pot. This is really good evidence that sodium either naturally occurring or added to their pottery as they were making it probably was done. Okay, here's a close-up. This is another a good example of sodium precipitation on the outer edges of the clay. To me, it's a perfect example, like I said, because if it were like a radiator effect, those edges would have probably dried first and collected a whole lot of sodium. Okay. This is one of my test pieces where this was a buff-colored clay, where I added various sodiums to the clay body, and that's what I got. This was actually would have been kind of a reddish-brown buff-colored clay, a natural clay. This is the same clay body. The one on the top had a lot of sodium involvement. I let it dry, sodium precipitated. And, you know, we look at a lot of the Mimbres pots that have kind of a white to gray look on the outside of the bowl, not even where it slipped, but on the outside of the bowl. Made me suspicious. Okay. I may be going a little overboard because the light's shining right on the top of this bowl, but I still see sodium precipitation on the rim. Okay. Now here too, this what we would call fire clouds on the top of this pot could have also been sodium precipitation. If you've made oyas, I'm sure most of you have, and you notice that sodium will, or the driest area will often be the top of the bowl, right? Especially the top part of the clay body. Okay. So is that what's happening here? As this pot dried, more sodium precipitated to the surface at the top rim of the bowl in different areas, depending on which way the wind was blowing. And this precipitation may have aided in the reduction and this kept-in reduction of the iron particles. Okay. Even back as far as the bold-face period, I know the lighting is tricking to the eye a little bit, but I still see darker areas toward the top part of the bowl than I do in the bottom part of the bowl. There again, could this be due to sodium precipitation? Okay. So this is what, I just took a picture of that to kind of show what sodium precipitation can do. but my water bottle there had sodium carbonate, which is soda ash, and it also had sodium chloride, which is basically just table salt. And boy, the bottle fell over, and what little bit of moisture was coming out of the bottle, look how much sodium precipitated to the surface. Okay. Now, when you think about the firing process, unfortunately that pot has a crack in it. I think it did before I even fired it. If they fired them kind of at an angle like this, that could also lead to how the heat of the fire and sodium precipitation played a role in the black and red parts. And if that was in a fire, if they were firing in that manner, which it appears to me they were, that some of these sodiums would melt so much so that they would seep clear through the clay body and down into the outer part of the pot. So, okay. You can skip that. That's just one of them. So this was one of my successes before I really started messing around with real natural sodiums. I was using fritted sodiums. I was using a frit called Frit 3110, which is a sodium borate frit. And I did actually get a pot to look kind of Mimbres-ish with the red and black. And now, like all of you, I want to be authentic. I don't want to rely on manufactured materials any more than I would have to. But I was trying to prove to myself that these low fire fluxes were playing a role, and this proved to me that they were. This one did as well. This pot was fired with just store-bought red iron oxide, and the whole pot came out red. But it had fugitive paint on the surface. So one day when I was playing around with the concepts of sodiums and sodium borates, I sloshed a brine of sodium into the bowl on one side, and then I refired it, and that's what happened. So I don't know, the question is to me, did they achieve some of the things they did in secondary firings, or were they just so good at understanding their minerals and their materials that they were able to achieve this without messing around with firing it twice? So I don't know. Okay.
We have a friend, Rod, and Swenson, and he says, they do not do things that are difficult, right? He doesn't believe that they painted twice, like I do, right? Like if I want to get a dark one. So he would say, there's no way that they fired it again, right? That it would have been too much extra effort, and that human beings try to do parsimony, I think.
Yeah.
The least amount of effort possible to get to the end result. So just throwing that in, because Rod wouldn't want me to say that.
You gotta wonder. You have to wonder. So anyway, I wrote this up there. It's boron. Boron, sodium borates are. I've had the best luck with sodium borates in doing this, and particularly borax. If you'll go on, I want to get at least to the end before I have to stop. Now this is some melty stuff, little melty particles that are glassy on a real actual member sherd. The next one. There's another one there. These are very shiny. I didn't get a good image of them, but they're very shiny little spots that are melted. And there's a really good one there on the left. You can see it's very circular, kind of like a particle literally melted, and it's visible to the eye. And there's some more there where even the paint is sticking to whatever these chunks of something are sticking up. The paint's actually even sticking to those, for Pete's sake, So, okay. So this is my test kiln. It's an old electric kiln I turned into a gas fire reduction kiln. And there I'm firing in reduction. And believe it or not, that my temperature, I think, on my gauge is only 13 something. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Now here's one of my successes as well. It's an actual member sherd on the bottom right. The top is a test piece that I did using borate and sodium minerals along with iron oxide, but I fired quite hot to get that. I was thinking about 1650. So I don't know if some of you are getting those temperatures, but I've been trying to stay within what is considered primitive pottery firing temperatures. Okay. Here's an example too of some of these little circular missing pieces. You can see these little freckles. that are quite circular. I wonder if those weren't little melty things that popped out of the body of the pot later on in life. Okay. Here's a test tile done also with borate minerals and sodium minerals combined with red hematite. Number 9, number 6, and number 7 were basically the same mixture of stuff. Okay. There's another picture of my test kiln. My test kiln is actually a propane-fired kiln. I use a weed burner actually on a propane bottle that shoots fire into the kiln. And like I said, I can control the amount of oxygen, the temperature, and all that. I know it's not primitive firing, but this is my preliminary test. This is where I try to see what happens in the thermal reactions. Okay. Then oftentimes, too, on camping trips, we'll fire pottery. I'm sure many of you have done that. There for a while, I had a visitor come to visit me while I was firing. A little tarantula came, sat by my chair while I was firing. Okay. And you can see how diligently I've been. Does this look like your guys' backyard? Okay. So, talking about where some of these really wonderful melty stuffs could have came from. This is Huntington Pueblo and also Lake Lucero. These are in the Tularosa Basin, just right near White Sands. These are on state or federal land. Very protected property. You can't go there. And if you can go there on a guided tour, but they don't allow you to pick up anything. So that's a bummer. But anyway, these were people who interacted quite a bit, quite extensively with the Mimbres people, either during or after the Mimbres' existence here. Nobody knows for sure that answer. Okay. So what did they find there? What did I find there? I found 2 borax mine claims. You see those red little rectangles there? Those are actually borax mine claims. I don't know when those claims were made, but apparently precipitated sodium borates are there. And if you look at where the lower one is, that's about Lake Lucero. If you look at the top one, that's about Huntington. Okay. This also is an example of how many Mimbres sherds were found in that region, that area. There's Lake Lucero and Huntington and other developments where the larger the red dot, the more Mimbres pottery sherds were found. Of course, we had to go there. My family, we went to White Sands. I collected some scaly, hardened sodium kind of flaky stuff on the surface of low areas. Probably wasn't supposed to, but I did. Okay. Now that was my son gathering some chunks. Here's another example of the amount of Mimbres sherds. Now these Mimbres sherds date all the way from boldface period all the way through the classic. So even the polychrome classic. Okay. So here's an interesting article too. It talks about how sodium borates can act as a flux for melting iron, but can also act as a barrier, or protective barrier around iron particles that prevent them from reoxidation. Isn't that interesting? So this is a chunk of a selenite on the right. Selenite is what eventually becomes white sands. It is calcium sulfate. The one on the left is not that at all, even though they look very closely the same. The one on the left is ulexite. Ulexite is a nice, melty, glassy material that melts at very low temperature, around 1400 degrees Fahrenheit. It would have been attractive, I think, to primitive people, because it looks like, it's also called TV stone, because when it's fiber optic. When you use it and look at it, it makes things almost kind of magnified. It's really interesting. So, and here's another interesting thing too: is if this is a magnification of a sherd, a Mimbres sherd, you see that white area right there. It's stronger than clay to me, even though we know those were probably polished in. But that whole part of the pot looks just stronger. The fracture is more straight. Where if you break your coffee mug, you're going to have straighter fractures. But if you break one of your ancient pots, it's going to be a very jagged fracture. Am I right about that? If you think about it. So if you notice, the white parts on these are often a little more straight fracture, which tells me it probably is firing a whole lot stronger than the pot itself. Okay. And here's another good example of that, but this also shows how the paint, oh, that's not a good picture. The paint never really seems to go seep deep into the white. It's always kind of laying on the surface. Okay. Here was one I was proud of just by accident, one of my test pieces. Now P is nothing but limonite and sodium borate and sodium chloride, which is salt, sea salt. Which, by the way, sodium chloride also is at that area in the Tularosa Basin. So the one on the left is actually Mimbres sherd. I was really happy that my my little test piece looked an awful lot like a Mimbres sherd. Okay. This is one of my test bowls, or one of my bowls that I painted with just limonite. And the red part was actually clay gathered from by a friend of mine up near, in the northern part of the Mogollon Mountains. So, okay. And that was after fired. It still didn't get that black for me, but I wasn't too unhappy with it. But that was limonite. Okay. So, I might be barely myself. I might be barely in the boldface period of learning this Mimbres thing, but I feel like I'm on the right track. I feel confident that sodiums or amelty stuff like sodiums are playing a big role. This is actually a Mimbres bowl. Okay, I just wanted to show a comparison that I'm not there yet, but I'm getting close. So I want to thank you, everyone, for taking the time to listen to me. And I know it's maybe some crazy things, but honestly, I've done a lot of testing. I've done over 200 tests in the last year and a half, testing different minerals at different temperatures, and I feel confident that for the Mimbres people to have been successful, and maybe even all the people up and down the Tularosa Basin, that sodiums in general played a role.
Okay. Thank you so much. Since we do have time on the schedule, let's take 5.